Hello, my name is Elizabeth Bice. I'm the Federal Treasurer of Socialist and a committee member of the NDP Socialist Caucus, past Secretary of the Toronto and York Region Labour Council, and a retired member of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. We acknowledge that this gathering takes place on Indigenous lands, including the unceded territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee people. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Today marks the 75th anniversary of the atomic bomb destruction of Hiroshima and Japan. We call for the scrapping of all nuclear weapons, starting with the arsenal of the USA. Tonight's webcast is titled The Formation of the Canadian Colonial Settler State with author and longtime socialist John Riddell, University of Manitoba Professor of History Peter Chesky, and discussant Maria Paez-Victor, a leading Venezuela solidarity activist, and I will be hosting the show. John Riddell will give a talk for about 15 minutes, followed by Peter, who will also speak for about 15 minutes. After that, Maria will speak for about 7 minutes. Then we will take a few questions from the online audience. Audience members can submit a question by accessing the webcast directly from YouTube and by typing the question directly on the chat column. Please direct your question to a specific person if you like, or to everybody. If you like this webcast, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. If you agree with what we are saying during this program, please join Socialist Action by signing up on our website, www.socialistaction.ca, or just give us a call, 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. So let's begin. John Riddell is a Marxist writer, historian, editor, translator, and activist. He is best known as editor of the Communist International in Lenin's Time, an 8-volume series of books of Communist International documents. In the 60s and 70s, he was a central leader of the League for Socialist Action, a predecessor party of our Socialist Action. So, welcome, John. We can't hear you, John.
Good. It helps to put the microphone on. I see. Hello. And
okay, you're on.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And it's an honor to be on this panel with such outstanding figures as Peter and Maria. My talk is based on input from a number of fellow activists, and I'll mention 2 in particular who are associated with the posters behind me. One is Marcelo Saavedra Vargas from Bolivia, and also the late Rosalia Paiva from Peru. Now, my talk is based on a pamphlet, which looks like this. I helped create it 50 years ago. It's called Red Power in Canada, published by the League for Socialist Action. It contained the program of a visionary Indigenous group on the West Coast, the Native Alliance for Red Power, that called for Indigenous sovereignty and reparations. Now, about that time, our rulers organized celebrations of what they called Confederation, the formation of the state of Canada. This extravaganza was met with wide skepticism, and not only among First Nations. Masses of Quebecers called Confederation les 100 ans d'injustice. Socialists in the rest of Canada picked up on this too. Here's what we put out at the time about the centenary, 100 years of injustice. We challenged not only the results of Confederation, but the unification itself. It was not democratic. The only popular involvement was the movement led by Louis Riddell, and that was crushed by military force. We socialists, picking up on Lenin's term for the Russian Tsarist Empire, called the Canadian state a prison house of peoples, and what we proposed was a general jailbreak. 30 years ago, the Constitution of so-called Canada was rewritten. Indigenous peoples were excluded from the negotiations. Quebec, whose proposals were ignored, refused to sign. These wrongs have not been righted. So when we speak of colonialism in Canada, this refers not only to the treatment of the Indigenous peoples here, but to the pervasive racist colonialism of the state as a whole. Colonialism reached Turtle Island as an expression of early European capitalism's drive for profits. The colonizers viewed profits as the ultimate and sole purpose of humankind. Colonial enterprises sought to scoop up precious metals, seize the land, and subjugate native peoples. Now, Karl Marx had something to say about this. He said the treatment of indigenous peoples was extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines. At first, indigenous people welcomed colonizers and provided assistance and know-how needed to survive in a harsh and unfamiliar environment. In return, the colonizers brought deadly infections to Turtle Island, which swept away up to 90% of the indigenous population, shattering the survivors' social cohesion and capacity for resistance. Beyond that, the colonizers' message to the indigenous peoples was, "You, go away," or "You work for me," or "You make war for me," or "You must die." All four methods were employed, depending on how best to secure profits. Through the centuries, settler society was never able to coexist in harmony with indigenous civilizations. And why then this incompatibility? So let's listen to the great Métis scholar and activist Howard Adams from his book, Prison of Grass. Before the Europeans arrived, he said, Indian society was governed without police, without kings and governors, without judges, and without a ruling class. There was no private property. Land was held in common by the tribe, with limits generally respected by surrounding peoples. The concept of a chief as ruler was a creation of the settlers. In fact, among indigenous peoples, order and discipline was enforced by common discussion and common opinion. There were no poor and needy by comparison with other members, and likewise no wealthy and privileged. Members of the community were bound to give each other support and assistance and protection. Sharing was a natural characteristic of their way of life. Individual profit-making was unknown. Everyone was equal in rights and benefits. In settler society, by contrast, sharing and solidarity was the exception. Class exploitation and profiteering was the rule. The communal civilization of indigenous peoples could not be assimilated into capitalist settler society with its principle of private ownership. Indigenous society had to be destroyed. And how did this work out in practice? The fishing industry off Newfoundland required only small lodgements on land, but that, combined with pervasive cruelty, led to the extinction of the island's original indigenous inhabitants. Then there were furs. Fortunes were made by selling animal furs acquired from indigenous peoples. The fur trade was a large-scale capitalist industry extending right out to the Rockies. Unlike fishing, the fur trade required a large native workforce and a substantial settler community. Indigenous peoples were super-exploited primary producers of marketable furs. Indigenous people were also enlisted as warriors to combat colonial rivals. This integration into a capitalist industry undermined indigenous communal social structures. Meanwhile, the settler workforce provided transport and produced food. Settlers who transported furs and trading goods, the coureurs des bois, were brutally exploited. The children born of their unions with indigenous women became victims of racism, the Metis. The settler food producers, peasants, were feudal serfs, toiling for the profit of feudal lords or seigneurs. All these layers were victims of the whims and extortions of the colonizing power, first France and then England. The English conquest in the 18th century added a new layer of colonial oppression. The Francophone population, whether white or Métis, now suffered under colonialist oppression at the hands of the British conquerors. British settlers, in turn, were mistreated by their royal masters in London and their agents in the colonies. After the British conquest, the fur trade was soon elbowed aside by new sources of profits, especially lumber, canals, railroads, and agricultural products. For the sake of these profits, massive tracts of land, indigenous land, were seized and the economic base of indigenous society was destroyed. Immense new tracts of land were seized, privatized, and thrown on the market for sale, another great source of profit. And while the fur trade had integrated indigenous people into the capitalist economy as its basic labor force, new industries such as logging and agriculture and transportation infrastructure excluded them entirely. Indigenous people were confined to detention camps called reserves, condemned to hunger and deprivation, and locked into Canadian apartheid. But Canadian colonialist oppression was many-layered. The English held sway over the French. The Protestant British scorned the Irish Catholics. The whites mistreated the Asians. The African slave population, freed only in 1834, faced racist segregation. Women strove for dignity and equality, and a mighty working class took shape, organized, and challenged corporate despotism. The challenge then before every democratic anti-colonialist movement was to bring together all the victims of capitalism and colonialism, from indigenous trappers to prairie homesteaders to Nova Scotia mine workers to Quebec habitants. This task was posed many times. The rebellious British colonies south of the St. Lawrence occupied Montreal for a time in 1775, but they did not succeed in linking up with Francophone Québécois. Meanwhile, First Nations, led by Joseph Brant and others, fought on the British side and were rewarded by further dispossession and marginalization. In 1837, working people in the settler colonies, then called Upper and Lower Canada, that is Ontario and Quebec, rose in revolt against colonialist dictatorship. The movement in Quebec included among its aims a pledge of full rights to the indigenous population. The Indians, they said, shall no longer be under any civil disqualification, but shall enjoy the same rights as any other citizens of Lower Canada. But First Nations were not in a position to affect the outcome, and the uprising was defeated. During the next decade, Britain granted autonomy to its discontented settlers in Canada. Settler society was plagued by antagonism between Anglophone and Francophone communities. Confederation was codified inequality and was imposed in 1867 without popular consultation. The Anglo-bourgeoisie held the levers of power, while Francophones influenced the government of a province. The focus of anti-colonial struggle then shifted to the Canadian West, and particularly to the democratic struggle led by Louis Riddell. I will leave it to Peter and Maria to speak of this. Let me say only that Riddell grasped that colonialism in Canada is hostile not only to Indigenous peoples and Métis, but also to settler workers and farmers. Riddell sought to forge an alliance on this basis, but the democratic movements he led in the prairies were brutally repressed, and with them the hopes of First Nations and Métis. Meanwhile, the settler farmers too fell victim to the railroads, the banks, and agribusiness. Once settled, the prairies lost population as capitalism drove masses of farmers off their land. Canada's racist colonialism has also been expressed internationally, as in Canada's present attempt to launch a military coup against the democratic government of Venezuela. In the last half-century, Indigenous peoples have raised their voices, pressed their demands, and gained in confidence and authority. They are once again a powerful presence in social movements and political life. Every progressive people's movement seeks to link up with Indigenous demands and Indigenous leadership. In my opinion, we should follow the logic of Glen Coulthard in his challenging new book, Red Skin, White Masks. In going beyond the goal of Indigenous recognition and reconciliation, Indigenous peoples should enjoy sovereignty, land restitution, reparations for damage done, and full scope to contribute freely to our common global human and natural environment. Let's work to overturn racist Canadian colonialism and the capitalist social order it created. And when I was in Caracas a few years back in Venezuela, a compañero then told me, our goal here is to reverse the conquest. Now, Indigenous writer Nick Estes has put it a bit differently. He says, our history is the future. And he quotes African revolutionist Amilcar Cabral, we must return to the source. I see this as a revolutionary return to a society based on solidarity and sharing, the principles that prevailed before the conquest. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John, and thank you for the recommendation of those two wonderful books. Okay, Peter Chesky is a full professor. He is originally from Bissett, Manitoba, and went to the government-run residential school, Frontier Collegiate in Cranberry Portage, Manitoba. He has taught in Native Studies departments at the University of Saskatchewan and Trent University. He joined the Department of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba in 2000. Welcome, Peter.
Well, thank you very much. And it's a great honor for me to be speaking partly with John Riddell, whose contribution to socialism in publishing the Proceedings of the Communist International is really absolutely critical. And of course, to you all, it's an honor for me to be working with you and speaking. I also have to say it's my honor to be speaking from land stolen from Anishinaabeg, Innu, Oji-Cree, Dakota, Lakota, and Dene peoples through treaties 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in Manitoba, and also the homeland of the Métis, land stolen through the misapplication or non-application of the Manitoba Act in 1870 and the period that followed. I agree entirely with pretty much everything that John has already said. So I'm going to, given that we haven't mentioned the Inuit, I might give a little Métis and Inuit spin on this. The first point that I want to make is that largely in Canada, it's a theoretical point, and then we'll get into the history. But I would say largely the Canadian state itself, as a state, pretty much largely exists, in my view, as the political arm of settler colonialism. It's the institution that in its own formation established its own self-structure as a way of basically largely taking land from Indigenous peoples, turning it over to settler colonials, only the wealthy of whom really genuinely benefited from this for the most part. The Canadian state has been heavily invested in what Karl Marx called primitive accumulation, the separating of people from the land, in this case Indigenous peoples from the land, including the Métis, and the attempts to turn those people into a proletariat, into wage workers, which is basically what residential schools were about. Get people disconnected from their land, lacking the skills to live on the land, and trained in the very minimum skills they would need in order to turn wrenches or shovel or whatever menial labor needed to be done. And that process basically continues. And we still see the Canadian state trying to access Indigenous resources all over, particularly the mid and far north, with the southern belt of Canada having been established as a largely agricultural settlement. So if we look at the Métis specifically, in the early history of Canada, 1867, we have Confederation, which John talked about. 1869, the government of Canada, a deal is brokered by England so that the Hudson's Bay Company can sell its rights to the lands, the Hudson's Bay watersheds, sells it to Canada so Canada can take control. However, Indigenous people said, we never sold our land. How does Canada get to claim, any use of this land when we're the real landholders? They didn't particularly have any respect for the charter that gave the Hudson's Bay Company land rights. That's what led to the numbered treaty process from 1870 on, but it also initially led to the first Métis resistance. So I'm going to talk about the Métis resistance of 1870 briefly, the Métis resistance of 1885, a little bit about the difference between them. And both were led by Riddell, but I choose not to call them the Riddell rebellions or the Riddell resistances. I think all of the Métis people are involved. Riddell deserves a lot of attention, is a very good leader, and was, kind of an organic intellectual from the people. But this was a strongly popularly supported resistance of the Metis Nation itself constructing itself as a nation. And it's important to emphasize that the Métis, don't develop from the first interactions between European males and Indigenous females upon the arrival of Europeans to the Americas, as is often said. The Métis Nation are a group of people who came about through mixed blood marriages, but began to occupy a specific structural position in the fur trade as clerks, as food suppliers, as manual laborers for the Hudson's Bay companies. And they began to intermarry amongst themselves. And when they begin to intermarry among themselves, they start forming their own distinct culture, borrowing elements of European and Indigenous culture, but also inventing, cultural elements of their own. And so by the time of the Riddell, the Métis resistances in 1870 and 1885, they are formed as a distinct people, see themselves as a distinct people, and act as a distinct people. And so when Canada takes control of Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company, the Métis say, well, wait a minute, we live here, we have land rights here, what's going to happen to us? And the government's answer at first is basically to ignore them. They're dirty Métis who we don't want to pay attention to. And with Riddell's led insurgency, the government basically doesn't have the railway constructed, can't get soldiers to Manitoba in an effective way, and so ends up being forced to negotiate. And so it's a resistance that leads to the Manitoba Act, and Louis Riddell is rightly positioned as, the father, the patriarch of Manitoba. By 1885, when the Métis around Batoche and in Saskatchewan start pressing for the same issues, The structural situation is very different. They call Riddell back. They have Riddell and Gabriel Dumont as leaders. But the railroad has largely been constructed. Canada is able to move an army very quickly out to the west. And does so. The first Canadian naval engagement actually takes place on the Saskatchewan River as the army commandeers a steamboat and tries to get to north of Batoche. But the Métis string a line across the river, which catches the post of the steamboat. And so the Métis can rain fire down on the steamboat from both sides of the river, basically, and force the steamboat back. Just an interesting little sideline. But that is state formation. That's the development of a part of the Canadian military apparatus that's specifically developed to try and deal with the Métis. Of course, the Metis Resistance in Batoche, as a result, goes badly. John A. Macdonald does to them what he had wanted to do in 1869-70 and basically sends the army in. And in this case, the army is able to fight the Métis to a standstill. Riddell doesn't take Dumont's advice and move into the bush and fight a guerrilla warfare, but stays at Batoche and makes Batoche sort of the battle site. Basically, the Métis run out of bullets and they're overrun by the forces of Canada, mostly from southern Ontario. Those resistances remain kind of at the heart of the Métis Nation. The Métis Nation takes great pride in those activities and in the sort of struggle and contestation that they engaged in trying to fight for their homelands. In both cases, in the case of the Manitoba Act, they were guaranteed a certain amount of land, 1.4 million acres of land, which was to be given to them individually through individual family land allotments called scrip. That scrip was mostly fraudulently taken from them, undervalued and bought by real estate agents or other speculators, and never really fully given out. So there was massive fraud, disorganization, and basically a lack of any sense of attentiveness that led the Métis to losing their land rights in Manitoba, and they were not guaranteed any such land rights in Saskatchewan, where they were basically treated as traitors. And so there were two Métis diasporas from 1870 and from 1885, where they largely just fled and lived in the bush further north and west in each case. Interestingly, Métis communities can be because of the use of individual scrip rather than the giving of collective land rights through the treaties. So the First Nations gained more intergenerational land rights and communities. So, we still have First Nation communities that have been around since. I'm trying to get the sun off of my screen here, so forgive me for a second. I'll see if this will help. So First Nation communities had a reserve land base, however small and unrelated to the size of their traditional territories. They did get a base where intergenerational communities could develop till the present day. The Métis, by being given individual scrip allotments, mostly, spread out, and although there are some Métis communities that have been left intact, many, much fewer. In Alberta, eventually in the 1930s, Alberta Métis Settlement Acts were created to support Métis settlements in Alberta as distinct Métis settlements. But basically no such legislation was passed in Manitoba or Saskatchewan or anywhere else. And where Métis communities stayed intact, as they did in some cases, it was mostly through informal mechanisms rather than kind of the formal structures of Canadian colonialism or of, lands held in common and those sorts of things, which did serve First Nations somewhat better. The other thing that I would sort of add to what John had to say is that there is a long history of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit resistances. There was there were First Nation groups going back to the 1920s and the League of Indians that were fighting to change the Indian Act and to try and establish self-government, sovereignty, land rights, those sorts of things. There were Marxist Métis activists like Malcolm Norris, who had a relationship with the then International Workers of the World, the Communist Party, and Jim Brady, both of whom pushed very hard against the federal government and the provincial government's policies for Métis. You can read about those two in the book, The 1.5 Men. George Manuel learned from Andrew Paul, was a protege of Andrew Paul's. He was the first and founding president of the National Indian Brotherhood. His son, Arthur Manuel, so George Manuel co-wrote with Michael Poslins the book, The Fourth World, which is also a worthy leftist style read. And George Manuel's son, Arthur Manuel, was an activist that I had the honor of working with. Arthur Manuel has a book called Unsettling Canada, and another book as well. The title escapes me at the moment. It passed away within the last few years, but both of those were both George and his son Arthur, and now Arthur's daughter, who's in the lead of the tiny house people struggle against the pipeline through the Rocky Mountains. You know, there are intergenerational legacies of resistance among Metis, among First Nations. I'll say that Inuit, I do have a minute or two left, Inuit are a distinct people in the Arctic regions of Canada. They live without trees, so their culture is very different. They were the result, if you talk to the archaeologists, of a more recent 1,000-year-old migration across the Bering Strait and into the Canadian, what's become the Canadian Arctic. Inuit became sort of legally recognized through a court case from 1939 called Reeskimos that said that they were a federal responsibility like status Indians. It was a court case involving the provincial and the federal government. You know, if you look at the whole formation of Canada from the legal perspective, Canada would be a very different place if the St. Catharines Milling case on how treaty rights were negotiated. If it had gone the other way, we would be living in a very different country with a much stronger federal government and much weaker provincial governments. For example, Reeskimos determined that Inuit people were a federal responsibility. So federal government policy towards Inuit really started to develop in the post-war period much more recently, and Inuit activism developed sort of at a pace from the 60s onwards. After really a decade or a decade and a half's worth of federal involvement, Inuit sort of developed their own sense of what they needed to do to push back and to fight for their particular Aboriginal rights. I might have a minute or two left. Let me just see. I do want to emphasize that all of these processes are still taking place. Primitive accumulation is still basically the go-to, that is resource extraction. It's the go-to of the federal government in terms of broad Canadian economic development. The cultural and economic mechanisms of settler colonialism are still very much in place. We have a long ways to go to change that. Maybe the last major point I would make is that, and with John, I would say, you know, Indigenous peoples in their traditional cultures practice and embody the values that we value as socialists. They practice and embody egalitarianism. You know, if you go to Indigenous communities, two of the things people talk about are caring and sharing. And as socialists, we're concerned about caring and sharing. Those are two values that we can get on board with. If Indigenous people were, you know, had a greater role in the overarching structures of this country, it would be a very different country, and in my view, it would be a socialist country. So it's very important that socialists get beyond demographically Indigenous people are a small part of the country, and they should be led by the vast majority of working people, to say that Indigenous people have a particular place. They have a role, but a distinctive role. And so that role should be appreciated by other members of the working class and working people, and respected as original inhabitants. Socialism itself has to respect Aboriginal rights, I would say. And in doing so, it's showing respect for the cultures of people who embody the values that are most precious to us. And that includes Métis, that includes Inuit, that includes First Nations. So maybe I'll leave my comments there. I think that I don't have my reading glasses on, but it looks to me like I've about used my time.
Okay, thank you so very much, Peter. It's very educational. Okay, Maria Paez Victor is a sociologist born in Venezuela, educated in Caracas, New York, Mexico City, England, and Canada. She has 20 years national and international experience in policy analysis and environmental assessment, with particular focus in the areas of health and energy. She is a leader of the Riddell Bolivarian Circle in Toronto. Welcome, Maria.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, we can.
Well, I think that after what we have heard Peter say, I'm not going to say too much about Louis Riel, even though that is the name of my Bolivarian Circle. We can talk about it later. But I do want to talk about colonialism and colonialism in Latin America. In 2004, while visiting Venezuela's largest military headquarters, the escorting sergeant showed me a room that had been the office of the USA Army. And astounded, I asked him, why did they have an office here? And he explained to me that at every military headquarters in the country, there had been a representative of the US Army until Hugo Chavez was elected and he told them all to leave. I thought, then we really were a colony. Hugo Chavez took Venezuela down the arduous path out of this new colonization. He established the Day of the Indigenous Resistance, and the statue of Columbus in the main plaza was soon toppled. There should be no glorification anywhere of this mass murderer who initiated one of the most extensive genocides in history against the original peoples of our America. Columbus personally led the massacre against the Taina, Arawak people of Haiti. Later, they were forced into enslavement, and it was so brutal that people killed their children and then committed suicide. So much so that today there are no original peoples in Haiti. One historian at the time said they were like hungry swine lusting after gold. The Spanish monarchs obtained more than 185,000 kilos of gold and 16 million kilos of silver, the fruit of the work of the slave work of indigenous peoples and abducted African people. About 15 million Africans were abducted and brought to the Caribbean, and about 5 or 6 million died on the way. So men maddened by gold, like Columbus, Cortés, Pizarro, Lope de Aguirre, they started the extermination of between 70 to 100 million indigenous peoples of Latin America. There is no other genocide that I know of this magnitude. But furthermore, their cultures have been lost. Between 1492 and 1570, entire people, if not killed, were enslaved for their own good. Their culture, their history, their languages were suppressed. The records, learning, music, theater, dance of the original peoples throughout the vast region were destroyed. It was also a cultural genocide. And it is this destruction of our history that lies at the heart of the contradictions, the dependency, and the exploitations that continue to this day in Latin America and the Caribbean, a continent that has been robbed of much more than just its rich resources. Its people have been denied its collective memory and true identity. And today, the corporate pillaging of Latin America, the racism with which our peoples are regarded, even at the level of international law, the misery under which many are still living has persisted due to imperialism, the twin of colonialism. Indigenous peoples in the 1500s were 99% of the population. Today, they're 30%, and they're amongst the poorest, suffering, misery, hounded by landowners, miners, multinational corporations that covet their lands and resources. The whole history of Latin America, the whole history is a history of the struggle for land and freedom. And today, it is the part of the world where the greatest number of environmental defenders are killed, mostly indigenous and rural people affected by mining, mega projects, industrial agriculture. And Spain was not the only guilty country. Guilt is shared by half of Europe because of the slave trade and many of the sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Indeed, it was Latin American gold and silver and African gold, ivory, and slave labor, which paved the way for European capitalist development. This was acknowledged even by John Maynard Keynes. Now, during colonization, Spain proceeded to substitute the cultures of our America for a European one. The colonial elites that emerged took their cue from the Spanish aristocracy with little interest in developing agriculture or industry, except in as much as they could benefit from it. And they didn't care about the welfare of the indigenous or Black population, except to subjugate it, eliminating their language, denying their worth to their traditions, all to be substituted by European values and an instrumental hollow Christianity. More than 1,000 indigenous languages disappeared in 500 years. That's 2 per year. This colonial society was based on rigid racial, oh dear, it's gone.
Continue, we can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me, oh great. Well, okay, where was I? The indigenous and Black people were considered lazy, unreliable, and even wicked. Now, recently, we saw in Bolivia the frightening resurrection of these prejudices by a white supremacist elite that deposed Evo Morales, the first indigenous president of the Americas.
You're gone. Is there a problem somewhere, Kurt? Yes, so it seems like we're having a technical problem with Maria. We'll give her a couple of seconds. What do you think, Kurt? Is there something that can be fixed from your end, or is it hers? Maria, if you can hear us, maybe you can use your mic.
Should I continue?
Yes, continue. Even if it's just a microphone, continue. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So this cultural destruction meant that the societies that emerged believed themselves to be a mere copy of European societies. Therefore, they persisted in their emulation of all that was European, and later, everything that was the United States, because the United States were presumed to be the beacon of modernity, and all that was Indian or Black was fundamentally backward. So this cultural domination was very intense in Venezuela, where US oil companies and other corporations acted as the socializing agent to produce leaders for Venezuela in business, politics, and armed forces and the police. All this, of course, has been stopped by the Bolivarian Revolution, hence their absolute spite and oppression and everything they've done against Chavez and Maduro. But Venezuela's elites lost the capacity to operate as instruments of national affirmation the more they became partners with the US foreign capitals and multinationals. This elite saw no sustained contact with the mass of the people. They had no role for them. They didn't feel pressured to meet their population, their needs. They have been, therefore, pivotal in the grim economic and media war against the Bolivarian Revolution. And against all odds, Chavez won the elections, and Chavez's Bolivarian Revolution succeeded in the eradication of illiteracy, lowering of infant mortality, lowering malnutrition, inequality, unemployment. They installed free healthcare, free schools, daycares, university, and of course, self-government for indigenous peoples. Poverty was dramatically reduced. Now, a successful leftist revolution was intolerable for the USA and Canada and all the allies. So these achievements had to be destroyed. And after President Chavez died, they intensified that war against Nicolás Maduro. But despite a brutal media discredit campaign, coup attempts, paramilitary attacks, assassination attempts by drone, cyber attack to the electricity grid, illegal sanctions, street terrorism, and this savage economic war that has destroyed the currency, they still have not managed to destroy President Maduro and the Bolivarian Revolution. So I just want to read to you something that Richard Black, a Republican senator, said, and he confessed it. He says, "We demonized their currency, and through the international banking system, we made the Venezuelan currency worthless. And then we go ahead and say, look how bad this government is. Your currency is worthless." Well, it wasn't them. It was us who made their currency useless. This is the vicious campaign that the United States has done, and that Canada has absolutely supported, more than supported, because it created the Lima Group to continue to try to destroy Venezuela. Ottawa's role has been particularly pitiful. Its shameful adherence to USA's regime change policies, trying to overthrow President Maduro with the pathetic Lima Group, sank its dream of a place in the Security Council of the United Nations as a Trump factotum was not welcome. Venezuela has dismantled the vestiges of the colonial society with its Bolivarian Revolution. We are free from and free to, whichever the color of our skin, whatever political system we democratically choose. Venezuela is no longer anybody's backyard. We will prevail. Venceremos. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Maria. As always, a very educational and passionate presentation. Okay, so thank you, everybody, of course. And now we will, with the help of our technical producer, Kurt Young, we're going to hear some questions. He will probably read out 3 questions, and you will each have up to 4 minutes to answer 1, 2, or 3. And the order of speakers, once you hear the questions, will be Peter, Maria, and John. So you each have up to 4 minutes. Kurt?
Okay, our first questions come from Marcelo Saavedra Vargas. He asks, do you think that remembering the original instruction of our territories, we should have a living constitution such as Aquimenac, Nemetic, back of the turtle, our Shakana Southern Cross? And then the next question comes from Barry Weisletter. He had a preamble, but I'll only ask his question. And what does Idle No More, Black Lives Matter, Métis, and Quebec rights advocates mean for the working class as a whole for its quest for an end to the minority class rule? And then our last question for this round is from YC Lee, or Porgy Amor. Peter, can you criticize neoliberal David Collinet and his interest in the Canadian North? After serving as defense minister, he's still pro-military, pro-defense, not good for First Nations.
Okay, thank you, Kurt. You've heard the questions, so we will now go to Peter.
Thank you. So around David Collinet, I haven't followed him specifically, but I did follow sort of the Harper regime's attempt to militarize the North. I saw it from the ground up in Pangnirtung on Baffin Island. The Canadian military came in to conduct exercises. They lost 2 soldiers in the fog, and they had to hire Inuit or deploy the Inuit Arctic Rangers to find the 2. So, and there is really no reason for the North to be militarized, but there are, because of the huge landmass and the natural resources, there are opportunities for wealthy Canadians with an eye on, making more super profits to try and get into the extractive industries that are moving into the North. I wanted to say something a bit about Idle No More and Black Lives Matter. And it's very important for socialists to get their mind around social distinctiveness. So that when Pierre Trudeau in 1969 brought about the White Paper, Statement of the Government of Canada on Indian Policy 1969, he was basing himself on the civil rights movement in the United States. He wanted to be Canada's Martin Luther King. It was like, I'm the Prime Minister, I'm going to bring about equality rights for Indigenous people, as is being pushed for in the United States. The problem was Indigenous people weren't looking for equality rights. They were looking for affirmative rights, Aboriginal rights. And so the civil rights struggle in the United States, the demands of Black Lives Matter actually are very specific to African American realities in the struggle for equality, don't translate well to the demands of Indigenous people who are looking for Aboriginal rights, treaty rights to be respected. So very different kinds of parameters. And those are both quite different than working class struggles. Working class people are literally fighting for time, given that they're exploited in factory jobs and so on. Indigenous peoples are looking for space. As Fanon points out, anti-colonial struggles are land-based struggles versus the classic oppressive struggles that Marx analyzed, which were about the theft of time. And so it's not, we need to, rather than naturalize sort of alliances, we need to articulate alliances. Indigenous people, I think, ultimately do much better fighting for socialism, but they need to fight for it on their terms and with their struggle in mind. And the working class has to, I believe, come to embrace that and realize how important it is in terms of their own struggle. And the last thing I would say is that the Indigenous constitutions of many different Indigenous nations across the country would be a much better foundation for a social reality in the part of the world that's called Canada than the existing Canadian constitutions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Maria?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Well, the first question about the Constitution, I think, is really important because with the experience of Venezuela, that we had a new constitution that was created by many representatives of the country with representatives of the indigenous people. We have a constitution that on the very first page, in the preamble and in the first pages, talks about our indigenous peoples. In Canada, if you talk about the Constitution of Canada, people's eyes sort of glaze over and nobody wants to know anything about it. But in Venezuela, people go around with the Constitution in their hand because it was written in a way that anyone who knows Spanish and who can read it can read it. Wasn't written in legalese. The most important thing from the indigenous point of view is that it has several chapters there about the indigenous peoples, about what Peter was just talking right now, that the Aboriginal people want to be able to basically govern themselves, but not in isolation. This was the nice thing about it, that they embraced the nation and said, Venezuela is ours too. And I'll give you an example. We're going to have parliamentary elections in December the 6th, and according to the Constitution, the indigenous peoples are allowed themselves to choose three representatives. Well, this is how they're going to be elected. Not like we do through a ballot, but the about 150 political organizations of the indigenous peoples get together in an assembly that is run by them, although it is observed by the electoral power of Venezuela, and the people will vote for their representatives by their hand. And so they're not secret, but this is the way they do it. They speak, they talk, they discuss it, and then they choose their representatives. And that is very important. I think, I know that Canadians understand the opening of the can of worms that it is, but listening to John and listening to Peter, I hope that one day Canada will have a proper constitution, a constitution that is truly participatory and that will truly include the culture, the political culture of the diverse indigenous peoples. So I agree with Peter. And as for these other struggles, the struggle of the Black Lives Matter and the Idle No More, and the indigenous peoples, we have to learn how to work together to understand that although there are many differences, we have to understand that the struggle for this type of justice is something that there can be many things that bring us together. I find that in Venezuela, the Aboriginal people and the African Venezuelans, as well as the working class, don't, from my point of view, from what I've watched, they don't seem to have any kind of conflict between them. The conflict is with corporations, with big projects, with things of that sort. So there is much in common, I would say, that if handled with respect to the different cultures, I think that one day I hope to see a proper Canadian constitution.
Okay, thank you very much, Maria. Okay, so we're going to move now to John.
Well, thank you. And I'd like to say that my companion Suzanne and I are very honored to have Marcelo Saavedra on the call with us tonight. Marcelo is a professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Ottawa. And with regard to the question of constitutions, I'm reminded of a remark that Marcelo made to Suzanne and me, I think about 10 years ago. And that is that the problem in Bolivia, where he comes from, is that the Bolivian people are trying to decolonize the Bolivian state. But the only instrument they have at hand to carry out this decolonization is the colonial state itself. How prophetic he was, because 10 years later, the colonial state reached out to overthrow, with the applause of the United States and Canada, to overthrow the democratic government. And what Maria is describing in Venezuela is a very intense process over a long period of time to grapple with this problem of carrying out decolonization within the framework of a colonialist state. I don't say they have all the answers, but they have certainly a number of very important experiences and gains. Now, with regard to Barry's question about the significance of movements of minority peoples and nations, like Idle No More, for the working class, I scribbled down on the chat list the name of a pamphlet published, I don't know, almost 60 years ago by George Breitman in the United States, called How a Minority Can Change Society. And what he was saying at the just as the African American liberation struggle neared its peak in the 1960s, was that this struggle had the potential to galvanize and lead working people as a whole in an anti-capitalist effort. And I think that just a touch of that dynamic can be seen in what has been happening around Black Lives Matter in the United States, and also to some extent in Canada over the last couple of months. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, John. Okay, so we're going to go back to Kurt for more questions, where we might be able to get 2 more rounds in. We will see. But the next round of 3 questions will be, you will have up to 3 minutes each to answer one or all. And the lineup will be Maria, Peter, and John. So Kurt, back to you.
Okay, so we have 2 questions that aren't directly on our subject at hand, but I believe we should ask them. So the first one is from Ryan T, and he asks, I thought the Bering Land Strait theory had been discredited. And the next one is from Jake Javanshir, who says, what about settler colonialism in Palestine? What is that? Okay. And then Marcelo Saavedra Vargas says, Latin America is a huge colonial and patriarchal misnomer. Our original name is Abayala. We got to decolonize our mind if we want to build a socialist order. And I apologize if for all the mispronunciations I've made.
Okay, thank you, Kurt. Okay, so we'll start with you, Maria. You have up to 3 minutes. Microphone, Maria.
I don't feel qualified to talk about the settler colonialism in Palestine, but as an observer of these events, I can only say that I am appalled, horrified about what is happening in Palestine, and I don't know what the answers are. Better minds than mine might find it, but I do find that it is a huge travesty that we see in Palestine the failure of international law to protect the Palestinian people, and also the failure in Israel, who should have known better, the failure of its leadership, its lack of humanity even. And I think that only some sort of very strong international power will be able to rescue the Palestinians from this dreadful situation in which they are, and which countries all over the world are watching, and yet nobody is able to put the bell on the cat, if you like. As to our name, Latin America. Well, I've always said I prefer to be called Latin because it's a dead empire that exists no more. But I totally agree that we should call ourselves the Abayala and talk about the Pachamama. That will take time, I presume, but it's more important than a name. I think the most important thing is for Latin America and the Caribbean to be able to truly integrate, and like Bolivar wanted, and like Hugo Chavez tried to bring together the integration in solidarity of Latin America and the Caribbean. And by the way, this is one of the things that the United States, of course, wanted to do, to destroy our CELAC and destroy all of our organizations. They've even recently tried to destroy Telesur. And I think that once we have that, then we can talk about names. But the most important thing is the political struggle that we have now of our peoples in Latin America to again come together and try to integrate and help each other to the common, the many common problems that we have and challenges. The right wing has really stopped why all these right-wing governments, the Bolsonaro, of course, horrible Duque and Piñera and Moreno, this was an attack precisely on that idea of Simón Bolívar. Simón Bolívar knew that we would never all truly be free. We would never all be free to be ourselves until we were together facing these great empires. And that's why I think that solidarity, this thought of Martí, that it was la patria grande, that we all belong to this patria, to this homeland, and we have to link our actions, our political action, in that type of solidarity, not trying to dominate one or the other, not trying to make a Brazil, but in respect. This is what we have to do first, that really solid organization, that solid integration. And I believe that it will come. I believe these right-wing governments have failed so miserably, and look at how they failed with the pandemic, that they will come down. They will come down like a tower of cards. We will see the downfall of Colombia, of Ecuador, of Bolivia. We will see
Maria.
Brazil. Okay, sorry. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Peter.
Well, I do want to thank Maria for what she said, and she points to the fact, and emphasize it, that the Venezuelan Constitution has some of the best written protections for Aboriginal rights, to my knowledge, that we see maybe anywhere in the world. So that's a very important accomplishment of the Bolivarian Revolution. The Bering Strait theory, I mean, first of all, every indigenous nation has its own story of how they arrived at where they arrived, and I respect all of those stories. The scientists have their own story, which still includes the Bering Strait, although it's thought that there may have been other ways and earlier arrivals in North America. To me, certainly we can say indigenous people have been here since time immemorial, regardless of what theory you subscribe to, and these are their homelands, and that's about all that needs to be said. I don't really want to necessarily wade into the Palestinian question. It's complex. I believe there are settler colonial mechanisms at work. I think it's important to distinguish between the Jewish state and the Jewish people. The Jewish people also have an ancestral relationship to that land. And there are two sides to the coin. One is, I do believe the Palestinians deserve more support. And the Israeli state is propped up by global imperialism. So maybe the Israeli state deserves a little less support. And then I guess I would say about the naming of Latin America, what we have is nominalism comes with colonialism. So there's such a thing in my view as colonial nominalism. We've renamed the world, all from every little piece of land to the structures of nations. The Americas have been renamed, called the Americas, in bigger and smaller ways. And that's one of the kind of symbolic aspects of colonialism that deserves to be paid attention to, absolutely. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Peter. John?
Yes, thank you. I'm just going to speak briefly and only on the point of Palestine. I think one can wonder at the question, why does the Canadian government feel compelled to show such fierce partisanship against any symbol or expression of solidarity with the people of Palestine? And I think the kinship is because of the colonialist character of the two states, and that the rulers in Ottawa, regardless of the party in power, look at the Israeli state and say, yes, that is one of ours. How can this be changed? We just had an experience. The Israeli government said that it would, in total violation of international law, annex major parts of the West Bank starting on the 1st of August. There were protests. We had two considerable protests in Toronto. There were protests around the world, and also a number of governments, even the Canadian government, felt obliged to say that this was not the right thing and that this would have consequences. In other words, not to use a dirty word, but in other words, they were threatening Israel with sanctions. So what happened, in fact, is that there have not been annexations. They have been kicked down the road. Israel is now thinking about having another election. So I don't say the question resolved. It was a very small victory, but nonetheless, it was a gain. And I think it shows that serious measures, the concept of sanctions, the concept of boycott and divestment, that this is a movement that can have an impact. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, John. Now we will go back to Kurt for three final questions, and when we come back, we will have 3 minutes for the panelists to answer one or two or all, and the speakers will be as followed. Peter will be first, Maria second, and John third. So, Kurt, 3 more questions, please, for the last round.
Okay, so we only have 2 questions, but I would like to inform anyone watching that Marcelo Fedra Vargas, it has a lot of good information in our chat. So as you're watching this, just look into the chat, and there's some worthwhile information for you to read. So our first question comes from Peter de Gama. In the context of the settler states, can you describe some of the contours of reversing impact of settler state colonialism and providing restitution, restoration, and sovereignty for indigenous peoples? And then our last question, it comes from our comrade YC. He's asked, can Maria comment on Simon Bolivar and his interest in indigenous peoples?
Okay, thank you, Kurt. So because it's just 2 questions, I will up the time if you so wish, and we will start off with Peter.
Okay, well, I'm happy to talk about reversing settler colonialism. I mean, certainly there are a number of things like at the macro level that we could do, such as, honoring the treaties with honor and as the court has said, basically implementing them or interpreting them with a liberal and generous eye. Particularly, I would say the most important thing about the treaties is to recognize that the so-called surrendered lands was not surrendered. I don't think any indigenous people thought they were giving up all of their land rights to their whole traditional territories. Those lands should be jointly managed by indigenous people and non-indigenous people. And I'm going to maybe use one very tiny example as a fulcrum that we can think of in a broader sense. At universities, we train people who go on to be conservation officers. Conservation officers are basically police of the bush. Their job is to tell indigenous hunters hunting season is over, or we want to make sure that you have the proper tag or whatever. And so you have whole generations of non-Aboriginal people going up north, policing indigenous hunters, trappers, and fishermen, confiscating their equipment, charging them, all sorts of things. That's absolutely backwards. Indigenous people should be in charge of the bush. They could be training non-Indigenous people, and people with a science orientation could be following them around and learning from them. They should be the ones who are making sure that the bush continues. I mean, Indigenous people invented perhaps the single most sustainable way of life of any form of human social organization that we've seen on this planet. So surely we have things to learn from them. And so I would say from just that little thing, from conservation, which is part of the way universities are still participating in colonialism, to every field of human social interaction, healthcare, child and family services, education. We can actually, it's not just developing a better system or pumping money into the existing system. It's absolutely thinking about fundamental principles in very different ways, drawing on indigenous traditional culture to think about how we teach kids and how we heal ourselves from the wounds of various traumas that would be useful for all peoples in Canada, not just indigenous peoples. We'll know that we've reversed colonialism when we're actually implementing, institutionalizing, or deinstitutionalizing indigenous life ways and values, which are very close to the socialist values. So thank you very much for the questions.
Thank you. Maria?
Thank you for that question about Bolivar, who is very close to my heart. You know, when Venezuela was the country that liberated 5 countries in Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, and of course we can call Panama too. So Simón Bolívar's army was very important because it left Venezuela to liberate the others. Now, before there were 3 attempts and they all failed because some of the attempts to liberate Venezuela were very centered on the white elites. The white elites tried to overthrow the Spanish, and they failed because they didn't include the people. Now, Simón Bolívar, who was smarter than everybody, knew this revolution will never be successful unless it is a revolution that everyone sees that it is for them too. So Simón Bolívar was instrumental in calling to the cause of the revolution the indigenous peoples and the Black people, those who were slaves, those who were freed slaves, and what we call the pardos, which were the mixed, the Metis, the mestizos. And this was the key to the success of the armies of Bolivar. He could not have done what he did without the thousands and thousands of indigenous peoples, pardos, and the Black people who flocked to his army. Bolivar was intensely, very much an abolitionist. Now, this was not an easy thing to say, oh yes, we're against slavery, because the elite was against that. The elite had slaves and wanted to keep them. And at first, he didn't want to antagonize them so much, but he realized this had to be. And when he was exiled in Haiti, Haiti was a marvelous place. The Haitian people, they fought the army of Napoleon and won. And their president, Pétion, he helped Bolivar. The only country in the world that helped Bolivar in Venezuela was Haiti. Gave him guns, gave him food, gave him, very important, gave him a printing press, which was pivotal for the revolution. And when he was in Haiti, Bolivar promised him that he would liberate the Venezuelan Black people. And sure enough, this is what happened. My own ancestor, who was my great-great-great-grandfather, was a son of a slave owner and a slave owner. And he was a captain and a lawyer in Bolivar's army. And he was helping Bolivar with the abolition of slaves. For his pains, the aristocracy of Carora killed him and cut him up into pieces. But in the end, Venezuela was the first country in this hemisphere to abolish slavery. Way before England, way before the United States, Venezuela abolished slavery. So I have to again say, without the knowledge of the indigenous peoples, without the help of the Black people who were liberated and slaves also who came, Venezuela would not have been free. nor would have been Colombia or Ecuador or Bolivia or Peru or Panama, because they were the backbone of the army of Simón Bolívar. They knew, they had a knowledge of the land, they had a knowledge of how to survive that land, and they were fearless. They were absolutely fearless. We know a lot about what they did and how they backed the independence. This is one of the things also of our indigenous peoples now. Our indigenous peoples today know that it was their ancestors. It was their ancestors, their people, who were fighting with Bolívar and who liberated Venezuela. That's why I think it is a question of pride to them also, the accomplishments of Venezuela, because they know and that their role has been acknowledged completely, politically and historically, their role as liberators. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Maria. And now to John.
Well, Peter and Maria have said it all, so I think I will pass this time.
Okay, John, thank you so very, very much. Okay, so special thanks to our panelists, John, Peter, and Maria, and to our producer, Kurt Young, of course, in Mississauga, and to everyone who participated in tonight's conversation. So, folks, please consider buying a subscription to the Socialist Action newspaper that I'm holding up. Only $25 for 1 year, and it's delivered to your door. To fill out the form, just visit our website at www.socialistaction.ca. That's www.socialistaction.ca. And if you would like to talk to us about joining, please write to socialistaction.canada@gmail.com or just call us at 647-986-1917. 647-986-1917. And once again, if you liked the show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. Okay, our next essay webcast is on Thursday, September the 10th at 7 p.m. And it is titled, Is There a Magic Money Tree? Really, a magic money tree. With Professor Radhika Desai. And she is the professor Department of Political Studies in the University of Manitoba. And for any details, you can just visit www.socialistaction.ca. So in the meantime, in between time, please stay safe, stay healthy, and be active. Bye for now.
Okay, well, Marie and John have left already.